There's a scene in 2 Samuel chapter 5 that most people slide right past without a second thought. David has just been anointed king over all of Israel. He's just taken Jerusalem, the city the Jebusites swore that even the blind and the lame could defend. The man is at the height of his power. And the Philistines, the people who had crushed Saul, who had mounted the first king of Israel's head on the walls of Beth-shan, heard what happened and made a decision. Destroy David before he had time to settle in. They spread out across the Valley of Rephaim. Take a moment and build that map in your mind. The Valley of Rephaim cuts through the region southwest of Jerusalem like a natural corridor. It was exactly the kind of terrain the Philistines loved. Relatively open, wide enough to maneuver heavy formations, and positioned so that any army coming down from Jerusalem would have to descend to meet them. It was a trap with the dimensions of an entire valley. And the Philistines didn't arrive carrying stone knives. They came as what they were: one of the most technologically advanced military forces in the ancient world. Descendants of what ancient records call the Sea Peoples, with Aegean roots, related to the Minoan and Mycenaean worlds. Warriors who had attempted to invade Egypt itself in the 12th century before Christ, and whom Pharaoh Ramesses III needed a massive naval battle in the Nile Delta to stop. The weapon that made the Philistines nearly unbeatable on open ground was iron. While most nations in the region were still working with bronze, the Philistines controlled iron metallurgy with almost exclusive dominance. We read in 1 Samuel chapter 13, verse 19, that there was no blacksmith to be found throughout all the land of Israel, because the Philistines had made certain of it, deliberately. They didn't want the Hebrews producing swords or spears. The Israelites had to travel down to Philistine cities just to sharpen their farming tools. Think about what that means on a battlefield. Philistine warriors carried long iron swords. The distinctive wide-bladed Philistine sword, visible in Egyptian depictions of the Sea Peoples, built for powerful downward strikes against unprotected infantry. They carried iron-tipped spears, far more penetrating and durable than bronze. They bore round shields, different from the oblong Egyptian design, engineered to protect the individual fighter in high mobility, close-quarters combat. They wore characteristic helmets with crests, identifiable in the Medinet Habu reliefs that show the Sea Peoples facing Ramesses III. And they also carried the khopesh, the curved, sickle-shaped sword of Egyptian origin, lethal for sweeping downward blows against enemies already thrown off balance. But what made the Philistines genuinely terrifying on open ground was their war chariots. Philistine chariots were combat platforms pulled by 2 horses, capable of carrying 2 or 3 fighters. On the flat terrain of the coast and in open valleys, they functioned exactly the way armored vehicles function today. Speed, impact, the ability to flank infantry formations before those formations could adjust. A Philistine chariot coming at full speed against an unprotected Israelite infantry line was a verdict before the fighting even started. That's why we read in Judges chapter 1, verse 19, that Judah couldn't drive out the inhabitants of the plain, because they had iron chariots. In the open floor of the Valley of Rephaim, those chariots would have been decisive. And David? David had none of that. David had infantry. He had tribal archers, light spearmen, slingers, the skilled warriors of the tribe of Benjamin, capable of hurling stones with lethal accuracy from either hand, right or left. He had agile mountain fighters, men shaped by years of combat in rough, uneven terrain. He had the Gibborim, his elite warriors, the 30 and the 3, men whose individual feats of arms had become legendary, but no iron, no chariots, none of the technology the Philistines used to dominate flat ground. What David had was something no Philistine commander possessed. David had access to a source of tactical intelligence that went beyond any scout, any spy, any terrain reconnaissance. As we read in 2 Samuel chapter 5, verse 19, David inquired of the Lord. Before moving a single step, before issuing one order, David asked. And the answer came, "Go up, for I will certainly deliver the Philistines into your hand." That was the first campaign in the Valley of Rephaim. The answer David received was direct: go up and attack. But David didn't attack head-on. With the Philistines spread across the valley floor, a frontal assault would have invited their chariots to fold around his flanks. He needed a different angle. He positioned his forces to the west of the Philistines, cutting across the rear of the enemy column. Picture the geometry of that. The Philistines had advanced into the valley, pushing eastward, deep into the mountains of Judah, with their line of retreat pointing back toward the Philistine coastal plain. David moved out of Jerusalem and took a position not in front of them, not in direct confrontation, but across the line between them and the way home. The strike came from the side, a lateral attack that cut the Philistine column in two. This maneuver only worked because David let the Philistines walk in deep. That's counterintuitive by any conventional military logic. Every commander's instinct is to stop the enemy as far from your center of power as possible. David did the opposite. He let them advance to the farthest interior point of the Judean mountains, all the way to the upper reach of the valley, the area that corresponds today to the region near Jerusalem's old railway station. The deeper they came, the farther they were from reinforcements, the narrower the space for their chariots to maneuver, and the more exposed their rear became. The Philistine defeat in that first campaign was so complete, so unexpected, so overwhelming in its psychological weight that they left behind on the field something no warrior of honor abandons willingly: their sacred images. As recorded in 2 Samuel chapter 5, verse 21, the Philistines left their battle gods behind, the idols they carried into combat as a source of divine protection. These objects were believed to hold real power. Leaving them meant fleeing in absolute panic, without time even to gather what they considered sacred. David had the images burned, but the story doesn't end there. And this is where the biblical account reveals something that goes past ordinary military calculation. The Philistines came back. We read in 2 Samuel chapter 5, verse 22, that the Philistines came up once more and spread themselves in the Valley of Rephaim. Think about what that tells you. An army that had suffered humiliating defeat, that had fled leaving their gods behind, came back to the same valley. That wasn't lack of intelligence. That was cold determination. The Philistines understood that if David consolidated his hold over all Israel, the balance of power in the entire region would shift in a way that couldn't be reversed. They needed to act while the kingdom was still new, while the tribal alliances were still fragile, while the window was still open. And they did exactly what they had done before: spread out across the same valley. What would any experienced general expect David to do now? The same thing that had worked the first time. Circle to the rear, strike the flank, repeat the winning move. The Philistines almost certainly anticipated that. They likely repositioned forces to cover the flanks, knowing that was where they'd been hit before. David inquired of the Lord again, and this time the answer was completely different. You shall not go up, circle around behind them, and come upon them in front of the balsam trees. As we read in 2 Samuel chapter 5, verse 23. And then the instruction that sets this battle apart from anything else in ancient warfare. And when you hear the sound of marching in the tops of the balsam trees, then rouse yourself, for then the Lord has gone out before you to strike down the army of the Philistines. Don't attack when you're ready. Don't attack when the position looks perfect. Don't attack on your own timing. Attack when the trees move. To understand why that instruction was tactical and not merely spiritual, you have to know the climatological geography of the Jerusalem region. The Valley of Rephaim sits southwest of Jerusalem, and the city is positioned to receive a daily sea breeze off the Mediterranean. That breeze arrives regularly around midday, flowing from the coast inland through the valleys and passes. When it reaches the Judean hill country, it moves the canopy of the trees in a way that's perceptible to anyone on the ground. A rhythmic, continuous swaying that anyone positioned in that terrain would hear and feel distinctly. David knew this. He knew it because that territory was written into his body. He'd pastured flocks on those hillsides. He'd run for his life across those slopes. This was home ground. The Philistines didn't know it. The grove of balsam trees, called in Hebrew the Bekaim, whose exact botanical identity isn't established with certainty, but which manuscripts describe as resinous trees, was positioned at the rear or along the flank of the Philistine army. Military analysts have long understood that fighting in forests cuts both ways. The trees provide cover, but they shatter communication between units, make command and control nearly impossible, and exert a claustrophobic psychological pressure on troops not adapted to that environment. The Greeks had a word for the irrational terror that forests provoke. Panic, derived from Pan, the spirit of the wild. The Philistines, warriors of the coast and the plain, kept their formations clear of that grove. They used it as a natural anchor for one flank, a barrier that covered one side of their position, but didn't venture inside. That was the decision that undid them. David divided his forces into two elements. The first, a dispersal force, took a visible position in the valley, in plain sight of the Philistines, functioning as a draw. It engaged the Philistines directly, then began pulling back gradually along the valley floor, pulling the Philistine army deeper into the corridor, closer to the tree line, farther from their fastest escape route. The second element, David's main force, entered the grove of balsam trees. Quietly, moving through the canopy with the kind of discipline only light infantry, shaped by years in mountain terrain, can sustain. No chariots to clatter. No heavy iron armor to drag against the brush. Agile fighters who knew how to move through dense forest without turning themselves into a tangle of obstacles. They positioned themselves at the Philistines' rear, between the enemy army and the road home, and they waited. Then the wind came. Around midday, the Mediterranean sea breeze rolled in off the coast and entered the Valley of Rephaim. The tops of the balsam trees began to move. That unmistakable sound of leaves and branches stirred by wind, a murmur that travels through an entire forest like a collective whisper. For anyone positioned inside that grove, that sound covered everything else. Footsteps became inaudible. An entire force could advance through the canopy without anyone outside hearing anything beyond the wind in the trees. David attacked. The Israelite force broke out of the forest against the Philistine rear at the exact moment the wind was at full strength. Natural acoustic cover at the precise instant of maximum movement. The Philistines, already drawn deeper into the valley by the dispersal force, now found themselves between two elements, with no clear escape route, on ground where their chariots couldn't perform. If you want to keep exploring how the commanders of ancient Israel turned terrain, weather, and obedience into tactical advantage, subscribe. There's a great deal more of this waiting in this series. The defeat was total. David didn't just break the Philistines, he pursued them. As recorded in 2 Samuel chapter 5, verse 25, the Israelite army struck them from Geba to Gezer. That's roughly 20 miles of active pursuit. David had planned the blocking of the escape route in advance, and this time he didn't allow the enemy to regroup. The pursuit was as deliberate as the attack itself. The Philistines never again threatened Jerusalem. Now stop and consider what just happened from a purely tactical standpoint. David won 2 engagements against a technologically superior force using 2 entirely different approaches. In the first campaign, the tool was positioning, circling to the rear, striking the flank of a column that had advanced too deep into hostile ground. In the second campaign, the tool was timing, not preparation time, not positioning time, but the precise instant when nature provided enough acoustic cover for a light infantry force to move through a forest unheard. Any experienced commander could have conceived the first approach. The second was impossible to anticipate without specific local knowledge or without the instruction David received. And here is what separates this battle from any purely technical military analysis. David didn't use the tree signal because he'd figured out local meteorology. He used it because he was told to use it. As we read in 2 Samuel chapter 5, verse 24, the instruction was exact. When you hear the sound in the tops of the balsam trees, move quickly, because the Lord has gone out before you. It wasn't just a tactical signal. It was a point of synchronization between human action and divine timing. Military analysts use the concept of a window of opportunity, the interval during which a specific approach works. Before that window, the move is premature. After it, the enemy has reorganized, the terrain has changed, the moment is gone. In the second battle of the Valley of Rephaim, the window was literally the duration of the midday wind through the balsam grove. 15 minutes early, silence in the forest, footsteps audible, the element of surprise gone. 15 minutes late. The wind dies, the leaves go still, the acoustic cover vanishes. David moved inside the window because he knew when it would open. There's an honest limitation worth naming here. This approach was specific to David, in that valley, in that season, with those troops. A heavy infantry force with chariots and bulky metal equipment could never have moved through a forest fast enough to use the wind window. The approach worked because David had exactly the kind of force it required. Light, quick, disciplined enough to move in silence and hold position for hours until the signal came. That also explains why the Philistines made the mistake of returning. The Valley of Rephaim had been favorable ground for them before, in earlier conflicts. They understood that terrain, wide enough for chariots, direct access to the coastal retreat route. In the first campaign, they'd been beaten tactically, hit from an unexpected angle. But they came back because they still trusted the ground. What they couldn't account for was that David wasn't simply reading the terrain. He was receiving instruction about how that specific terrain functioned under specific conditions of wind and time of day. You can't counter-spy on intelligence coming from a source you don't know exists. There's an image that stays with you after all of this settles. A forest at midday. The Mediterranean wind arriving from the coast. The tops of the balsam trees beginning to move. First one tree, then the next. Then the whole grove in motion at once. That collective sound traveling through the canopy like a wave. And inside those trees, hundreds of Israelite warriors standing still, breathing, waiting. Each one understanding that the signal isn't theirs to give. It's not the commander's count. It's not the tactical calculation. It's not the math of numbers or the geometry of position. The wind decides, and the wind came when it was supposed to come. As we read in 1 Chronicles chapter 14 verse 17, the fame of David went out into all lands, and the Lord brought the fear of him upon all nations. It wasn't iron that did that, not the number of chariots, not the reach of the walls or the sophistication of the weapons. It was the pattern of a life in which the question came before the movement. where no battle began without David first asking, and no attack was launched before the answer came. The Valley of Rephaim is not just the account of two battles won. It's the account of a king who learned that the right moment, in the right position, with the right instruction, is worth more than any weapons advantage the enemy could possibly carry into the field. The trees moved, and Israel advanced.